Don't let him drink that champagne. The words cut through the gala just as Nathaniel Brooks lifted his glass. The room went silent. A dozen heads turned toward the woman standing beside the silver service cart. Aaliyah Carter was wearing a black server's uniform, her white collar pressed neatly beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. She held the tray steady, but her eyes were fixed on the elderly man beside Nathaniel. His father. Excuse me. Nathaniel's voice hardened. Aaliyah swallowed. Sir, please look at his hands. The old man's fingers trembled against the stem of his glass. Around them, guests in tailored tuxedos and evening gowns exchanged uneasy glances. Nathaniel didn't look at his father. He looked at Aaliyah, then at the uniform, then back at her face. You're a waitress. The words were quiet, but they carried farther than he intended. Aaliyah felt the heat of the ballroom against her skin. The polished marble beneath her shoes seemed suddenly colder. Yes, sir, she said. And you're interrupting my father's toast. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. The Brooks Foundation was announcing a $10 million scholarship initiative at the Grand Meridian Hotel in Manhattan, and every camera in the ballroom was waiting for him to raise that glass. Nothing was supposed to interrupt the moment. Not a nervous server. Not a warning. Not a woman he had never noticed until she stepped across an invisible line. Aaliyah looked at the elderly man again. His breathing had changed. Just slightly. But she noticed. She had learned to notice small things. I'm not trying to interrupt anything, she said. I'm trying to tell you something is wrong. A soft laugh came from somewhere near the VIP table. Nathaniel heard it. So did Aaliyah. His face grew colder. Security. Two men near the entrance turned immediately. Aaliyah's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. The champagne glasses chimed softly against one another. Mr. Brooks, she said, keeping her voice low, please don't let him drink it. For 1 second, Nathaniel stared at her. Then he pointed toward the ballroom doors. Take her out. The words landed harder than the music ever had. Aaliyah stood still. The chandeliers glittered above her. The champagne remained untouched. And as the security team began walking toward her, Nathaniel lifted his glass anyway. Then Aaliyah looked at him one last time and said, You're about to make the same mistake twice. Aaliyah did not move. The two security officers stopped a few feet away, waiting for her to make a scene. She did not. She lowered the tray carefully onto the service cart and kept her eyes on Nathaniel Brooks. Behind him, the ballroom continued to glow as if nothing had happened. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the marble floor. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. The guests watched Aaliyah with the kind of silence that felt louder than conversation. She knew that silence. She had met it in hotel lobbies, private dining rooms, and expensive restaurants where people looked at her uniform before they looked at her face. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she was not being removed because she had made a mistake. She was being removed because she had noticed something important, and Nathaniel Brooks had decided that her voice did not belong in the room. Miss Carter, one of the security officers said calmly, please come with us. Aaliyah nodded once. I understand. She turned toward the doors. Her shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor. Every step carried her farther from the warmth of the ballroom and closer to the cool air of the hotel corridor. She could hear the music behind her. She could hear the soft murmur of guests beginning to talk again. And she could hear Nathaniel's voice rising above them. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Aaliyah stopped for half a second. He had lifted the champagne glass. She could not see his father clearly from the doorway, but she could still see the tremor in his hand. Small, almost invisible, the kind of detail most people would miss. Aaliyah had spent years learning not to miss things. She had learned it in emergency rooms, where a change in breathing could matter more than a loud alarm. She had learned it while caring for her mother in a small apartment in Queens, where every medication bottle, every appointment, and every quiet change in energy mattered. She had once worked as an emergency room technician. That job had taught her to stay calm when everyone else was looking at the wrong thing. But life had changed. Her mother had become sick. The bills had arrived faster than the paychecks. Aaliyah had left the hospital and taken whatever work she could find. Tonight, that work was serving champagne to people who would never know what she had given up to stand there. As she reached the hotel corridor, she glanced back through the open doors. Nathaniel was smiling for the crowd. His father stood beside him. The glass remained in his hand. Aaliyah felt a tightness in her chest, not from fear, but from the knowledge that she had already done everything she could. She had spoken clearly. She had warned him twice. Now the decision belonged to him. Outside the ballroom, the air felt cooler. Aaliyah walked toward the lobby, passing tall windows that reflected her image back at her. Black uniform, tired eyes, straight shoulders. She stopped beside the coat check and reached into her pocket. Her fingers touched a folded napkin. She had written something on it moments earlier, before the guards came. She unfolded it slowly and looked at the words. Then she placed it on the nearest table and walked toward the hotel entrance. Behind her, the music suddenly stopped. Nathaniel Brooks had spent 30 years learning how to make a room listen to him. At 48, he knew exactly when to smile, when to pause, and when to let silence do the work. He had built a technology company from a small office in Boston into a national business with thousands of employees. His name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and scholarship programs. People called him disciplined, visionary, generous. Few people ever called him wrong. Not in public. Not in a room filled with donors, cameras, and people waiting for his next announcement. The Grand Meridian Hotel had been chosen for tonight's gala because Nathaniel wanted everything to look perfect. The ballroom held nearly 400 guests. The walls were lined with tall windows overlooking Manhattan, and the tables were covered in white linen, polished silver, and small arrangements of white roses. At the center of it all stood Nathaniel's father, Charles Brooks, an 81-year-old retired judge who had spent decades being introduced as a man whose opinion could change a room. Nathaniel had arranged the entire evening around him. His father was supposed to raise a glass, say a few words, and then watch Nathaniel announce the Brooks Foundation's $10 million scholarship initiative. It was supposed to be a celebration of family, success, and legacy. Nathaniel had rehearsed every detail. The speech had been revised 6 times. The lighting had been adjusted so the cameras would capture the right angle. The champagne had been selected weeks in advance. Even the timing of the applause had been discussed with the event coordinator. What Nathaniel had not planned for was Aaliyah Carter. He had noticed her earlier, though he would never have admitted it. She moved quietly through the ballroom in a black server's uniform, carrying trays and collecting empty glasses. She did not draw attention to herself. She did not need to. Aaliyah watched. She noticed which guests needed water before they asked. She noticed when an elderly woman looked lost near the restrooms. She noticed when a staff member's hand began to shake from exhaustion. Nathaniel saw only a server who had stepped too close to the VIP area. That was the difference between them. Aaliyah looked at people. Nathaniel looked at roles. He saw a billionaire, a judge, a donor, a guest, a staff member. The room had already taught him who mattered. And when Aaliyah spoke, he responded according to the rules he had trusted his entire life. She was a black waitress in a room filled with wealthy white guests. To Nathaniel, that meant she belonged near the walls, near the service doors, and far from the decisions being made at the center of the room. He did not know that Aaliyah had spent years working beside doctors in emergency rooms. He did not know that she had learned to recognize danger in a person's breathing before most people even noticed a change. He did not know that her mother was waiting for her at home in Queens, or that Aaliyah had accepted tonight's shift because the extra $240 would help cover another prescription. He did not know any of that. And because he did not know her story, Nathaniel had mistaken her position for her worth. Then, from the lobby, the music stopped. Nathaniel turned toward the ballroom doors. For the first time that evening, the perfect plan began to slip out of his hands. The music had stopped. Nathaniel stood beside the stage, one hand still wrapped around the champagne glass, while the silence spread through the ballroom. At first, he assumed the quartet had simply paused. Then he saw the guests turning toward the lobby. Aaliyah was gone. The security officers had escorted her through the doors. The folded napkin she had left behind sat alone on a small table near the coat check. Nathaniel's eyes moved toward it, but before he could take a step, his father shifted beside him. Charles Brooks placed one hand against the edge of the table. His face had lost some of its color. "Dad?" Nathaniel asked. Charles looked at him, but did not answer immediately. His breathing was slower now, uneven. Nathaniel set the champagne glass down. "Are you all right?" Charles nodded, though the movement was barely visible. "Just a little tired." Around them, the guests waited. Someone near the stage whispered that the announcement should continue. The event coordinator looked toward Nathaniel with a nervous smile. Everything was still moving according to the schedule. The cameras were ready. The donors were watching. The microphone stood beneath the spotlight. Nathaniel looked at his father again. Then he looked toward the lobby doors. For the first time, Aaliyah's warning returned to him with uncomfortable clarity. Do not let him drink it. He glanced at the glass on the table. Charles had not touched it. Nathaniel felt a strange irritation rise inside him. He had been told that Aaliyah was a problem. He had agreed. He had watched her leave. And now, with his father standing beside him, he could not decide whether her concern had been genuine or whether she had simply wanted attention. Nathaniel, Charles said quietly. The toast. His voice was calm, but softer than before. Nathaniel looked at the audience. Hundreds of faces waited for him to speak. He stepped toward the microphone. Good evening, everyone. His voice carried through the ballroom, but his attention was no longer on the speech. He kept looking at his father. Charles lifted his hand slightly, as if to reassure him. Then he stopped. His fingers rested against his chest. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice. But Nathaniel noticed. The room seemed to narrow around him. The chandeliers blurred at the edges of his vision. Somewhere behind him, a server placed a glass on a tray. The small sound of crystal touching metal seemed impossibly loud. Dad, Nathaniel said again. Charles looked toward him. I am fine. But Aaliyah had said the same thing in a different way. Look at his hands. Nathaniel did. The tremor was still there. He turned toward the nearest event medic. Can you come here for a moment? The medic approached quickly, but before he reached Charles, Nathaniel saw the folded napkin through the open lobby doors. Aaliyah's handwriting was visible from across the room. He could not read every word. He could read only one line. Do not let him drink the champagne. Nathaniel looked back at his father. The smile he had prepared for the cameras disappeared. And somewhere beyond the hotel entrance, Aaliyah Carter was walking away, believing she had done everything she could. She did not know that the man who had ordered her out was finally beginning to understand why she had spoken. Aaliyah had reached the hotel entrance when the cold night air touched her face. The revolving doors turned behind her, carrying the warm glow of the gala into the street and then sealing it away again. She stood beneath the awning for a moment, looking at the rain beginning to gather along the curb. Her shift had ended differently than she expected. She had come for the extra money. She had planned to work quietly, finish her hours, and take the subway home to Queens. Instead, she had been escorted out in front of a ballroom full of strangers because she had tried to warn a man who did not believe she belonged near his family. Aaliyah reached into her coat pocket and felt the folded napkin. She had written the warning after noticing Charles Brooks's hands. She had seen the way he held the glass. She had noticed the change in his breathing. She had recognized the signs because she had spent years learning to pay attention when other people were too distracted to look. But Nathaniel had not looked. He had looked at her uniform. He had looked at the room around her. He had decided who she was before she finished speaking. Aaliyah stepped away from the entrance and began walking toward the corner. The rain was light, but the wind pushed it against her face. Behind her, the doors opened again. A voice called her name. She did not hear it. Inside the ballroom, Nathaniel had finally moved away from the microphone. The event medic was beside his father now, asking simple questions and checking his condition. Charles answered, but his voice had become quieter. Nathaniel stood nearby, unable to focus on the crowd. The scholarship announcement had disappeared from his mind. The cameras were still pointed toward him. The donors were still waiting. But all he could think about was the woman he had sent away. Where did she go? He asked one of the security officers. The officer looked toward the entrance. She left the hotel. Nathaniel looked at the clock above the ballroom doors. Less than 5 minutes had passed. It should have been easy to find her. The hotel entrance opened onto a busy avenue, and the rain had sent people moving quickly beneath umbrellas. Nathaniel walked toward the lobby, passing the small table where Aaliyah had left the napkin. He picked it up. The paper was folded twice. Inside, beneath the warning, there was another line. If he feels dizzy, keep him seated and call for medical help immediately. Nathaniel read it twice. Then a third time. She had not written it for attention. She had not written it to embarrass him. She had written it because she had noticed something, and because she had tried to help. Nathaniel looked toward the street. Through the glass doors, he saw a figure in a dark coat walking away beneath the hotel lights. Wait, he said. The figure did not turn. Nathaniel pushed through the doors and stepped into the rain. Behind him, the gala continued to wait. For the first time that night, Nathaniel Brooks did not care about the schedule, the cameras, or the people watching. He only knew that he had made a decision before he knew the person standing in front of him. And now, for the first time, he was running after the truth. Aaliyah heard the sound of footsteps behind her, but she kept walking. Rain tapped softly against the pavement, turning the streetlights into long golden reflections across the sidewalk. Her coat was thin, and the damp air had already begun to settle into her sleeves. She had no umbrella. She had not expected to be outside for long. The hotel was supposed to be a simple shift. Work, collect her $240, take the train home, and check on her mother before midnight. That had been the plan. Now, behind her, Nathaniel Brooks was calling her name. Miss Carter. Aaliyah stopped. She did not turn immediately. For a few seconds, there was only the rain, the distant sound of traffic, and the soft hum of the hotel entrance behind her. Then she turned. Nathaniel stood several yards away, his expensive suit darkened by the rain. He had come outside without an umbrella. For the first time that evening, he looked less like the man who had controlled the entire ballroom, and more like someone who had suddenly realized he had lost control of something important. Aaliyah looked at him, then at the hotel doors behind him. "Is your father all right?" she asked. Nathaniel hesitated. "The medic is with him." That was not my question. The words were calm. They were not angry. Somehow, that made them harder for him to answer. Nathaniel looked down at the folded napkin in his hand. "He is being checked." Aaliyah nodded. "Then you should go back inside." She turned away. "Wait." This time, his voice stopped her. Nathaniel took a few steps closer, but he did not come too near. "You were right about his hands." Aaliyah looked at him. "I know." The answer landed quietly between them. Nathaniel had expected anger. He had expected an accusation. He had not expected certainty. "You noticed something before anyone else did," he said. "Yes." "How?" Aaliyah looked toward the rain falling beneath the streetlight. "Because I was paying attention." Nathaniel had no answer to that. The sentence was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened inside the ballroom. He had been surrounded by hundreds of people, and yet he had not noticed what was happening beside him. Aaliyah had been carrying trays, moving between tables, and being ignored. Yet she had seen the one thing that mattered. Nathaniel looked at her uniform beneath the coat. "You worked in emergency medicine." It was not a question. Aaliyah's expression changed slightly. "A long time ago." "Why did you leave?" She looked toward the street. "My mother needed me." Nathaniel understood the words, but not the cost behind them. He had never had to choose between a career and a family member's care. He had never had to calculate whether a shift was worth the cost of missing sleep. Aaliyah took one step toward the corner. "Mr. Brooks, your father may need you." Nathaniel nodded, but he did not move. "I am sorry." The rain continued to fall. Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment. "You should be sorry for deciding I was not worth listening to." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. The hotel lights reflected in the wet pavement between them. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Aaliyah turned and walked away. Nathaniel remained beneath the rain, holding the napkin in his hand. The words on it were small. The lesson was not. Nathaniel remained beneath the hotel awning long after Aaliyah disappeared around the corner. The rain fell steadily now, washing the pavement clean and carrying the city lights into blurred ribbons of gold. In his hand, the folded napkin had begun to soften at the edges. He looked down at the words again. "If he feels dizzy, keep him seated and call for medical help immediately." It was not a dramatic warning. It was not written to frighten anyone. It was simple, practical, and precise. The kind of instruction written by someone who knew what to do when other people were still trying to understand what was happening. Nathaniel turned back toward the hotel. Inside the ballroom, the evening had changed completely. The guests who had been laughing now spoke in quiet voices. The music had not resumed. The scholarship announcement remained unfinished. Charles Brooks sat in a private lounge near the ballroom, surrounded by medical professionals and family members. He was awake, speaking clearly, and being monitored carefully. The medic had told Nathaniel that getting him seated quickly had been the right decision. The champagne had remained untouched. "Who is she?" Charles asked. Nathaniel stood beside the window. For a moment, he said nothing. "Her name is Aaliyah Carter." Charles looked at him. "The server?" Nathaniel felt the words settle uncomfortably in the room. "Yes." Charles studied his son's face. "You know her?" Nathaniel looked down at the napkin. "No. I thought I did." Charles was quiet. Nathaniel had spent his entire life believing that knowing a person's position meant understanding the person. He knew who owned companies. He knew who sat on boards. He knew who donated millions of dollars. He knew who belonged in a private room and who waited outside it. But he had never asked himself what he really knew about Aaliyah Carter. He had seen a black woman in a server's uniform and made a decision before she finished speaking. He had assumed that the uniform explained her education, her experience, and her worth. Now, the facts were beginning to gather around him. Aaliyah had worked in emergency medicine. She had recognized a warning sign. She had tried to help. She had been ignored. Then she had been removed from the room. Nathaniel looked at his father. "I made a mistake." Charles gave him a tired smile. "You made more than one." Nathaniel accepted the words without defending himself. His father had always been direct. "I need to find her," Nathaniel said. "Why?" Nathaniel looked toward the ballroom doors. "Because I need to apologize." Charles watched him carefully. "An apology is not a payment." Nathaniel nodded. "I know. And it is not a way to make yourself feel better." Nathaniel looked at the rain beyond the glass. "I know that too." For the first time that night, he understood what Aaliyah had given him. Not forgiveness. Not a second chance. Only the truth. And the truth was that the woman he had treated as invisible had been the only person in the room paying close enough attention to save his father from a decision no one else had noticed. Nathaniel folded the napkin carefully and placed it in his pocket. Then he walked back toward the ballroom, not to finish his speech, but to tell the truth about what had happened. Nathaniel did not return to the microphone. He walked to the center of the ballroom instead, where the same people who had watched Aaliyah leave were now watching him. The room grew quiet as he approached the stage. His father remained in the private lounge, stable and under careful observation. The medical team had assured Nathaniel that he was safe for the moment. But Nathaniel no longer felt safe inside the version of himself he had brought into the gala. He stood beneath the warm lights and looked across the room. The guests waited for an explanation. The event coordinator waited for instructions. The cameras were still ready. The $10 million announcement was still written on the screen behind him. Nathaniel looked at the words, then turned away from them. "Before we continue," he said, "I need to correct something." A few guests exchanged glances. Nathaniel's voice was steady, but there was no practiced smile on his face now. "A member of the service staff tried to warn me about my father. I did not listen to her." The room became completely still. "I assumed that because she was wearing a server's uniform, she could not possibly know something I did not know." Nathaniel paused. The sentence sounded worse when spoken aloud. He could hear the truth of it clearly now. "She was right. I was wrong." No one moved. Nathaniel continued. "Her name is Aaliyah Carter. I ordered her to leave this gala because I decided she did not belong near the people I considered important." He looked toward the ballroom doors. But she was the person who noticed what everyone else missed. The words did not erase what he had done. They did not turn the room into a place of instant forgiveness. But for the first time that evening, Nathaniel was not trying to control the story. He was telling the truth. After the announcement, he asked the hotel staff if anyone knew where Aaliyah lived or how to contact her. They did not give him personal information, and Nathaniel understood why. He could have called a driver. He could have sent an assistant. He could have offered money. None of those things would have changed what had happened. So he waited. Nearly an hour later, he found Aaliyah outside a small neighborhood pharmacy in Queens. She had just picked up medication for her mother. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalk was still wet. Nathaniel stepped out of his car and stopped several feet away. Aaliyah saw him immediately. "Your father?" she asked. "He is stable." She nodded. "Good." Nathaniel took a breath. "I came to apologize." Aaliyah looked at him quietly. "For what?" He understood the question. "For deciding I knew who you were without asking. For ignoring your warning. For treating you like you were a problem instead of a person." Aaliyah held the pharmacy bag against her coat. Nathaniel continued. "I cannot undo what happened." "No," she said. "You cannot." The words were not cruel. They were simply true. Nathaniel nodded. "But I can make sure I do not make the same decision again." Aaliyah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That would be a better apology." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. For the first time in his life, he understood that redemption did not begin with being forgiven. It began with accepting the truth without asking someone else to make it easier. The next morning, the Grand Meridian Hotel looked exactly as it always had. The marble floors were polished. The chandeliers were bright. Staff members moved quietly through the halls, preparing for another day. Nothing in the building showed what had happened the night before. But Nathaniel Brooks had not slept. He sat alone in his office with the folded napkin on his desk. The ink had blurred slightly from the rain, but the words were still clear. Keep him seated. Call for medical help. He had read those words so many times that he no longer needed to look at them. What stayed with him was not the warning. It was the moment before it. Aaliyah, standing in the ballroom, the tray in her hands. The way she had spoken calmly, while everyone else was looking at her, as if she were the problem. Nathaniel had spent years building a foundation that claimed to create opportunity for people who had been overlooked. Yet, in one room, he had overlooked a woman standing directly in front of him because her uniform had made her invisible. He had not announced the scholarship initiative the night before. Instead, he had returned to the ballroom and told the guests what had happened. The story spread quickly through the people who had been there. Some were uncomfortable. Some apologized to Aaliyah when they saw her again. Others said nothing. Nathaniel did not expect everyone to change overnight. He knew better now. Change was not a speech. It was what a person did when no one was watching. 3 weeks later, Aaliyah returned to the Grand Meridian Hotel. She was not wearing a server's uniform. She stood in a small conference room with Nathaniel, 2 foundation directors, and a community health advisor. On the table lay a new proposal. The Brooks Foundation would create a paid training program for adults who had left healthcare careers to care for family members. Participants would receive tuition support, transportation assistance, and flexible scheduling. The program would be named after no one. Nathaniel had suggested using his family name. Aaliyah had declined. Let the work be bigger than the person who funds it, she had said. Nathaniel had listened. That was the difference now. He did not always agree with her. He did not always understand every decision. But he listened before deciding. Months passed. Aaliyah returned to healthcare training. Her mother continued to recover at home in Queens. Nathaniel still hosted galas, still ran his company, and still stood in rooms where people expected him to be the most important person there. But sometimes, before he spoke, he looked around. He looked at the person carrying the tray, the person waiting near the door, the person standing quietly at the edge of the room. He had learned that dignity did not announce itself. It did not always arrive in a tailored suit or sit beneath a spotlight. Sometimes it stood in a black uniform, holding a silver tray, trying to warn someone who had already decided not to listen. On the night of the next gala, Nathaniel stood near the ballroom entrance. Aaliyah was not working there. She had no reason to be. Yet he still found himself looking toward the doors. The music began. The lights came on. Guests entered beneath the chandeliers. Nathaniel took a slow breath and stepped aside, making room for everyone to pass. Then the doors closed softly behind them. And for a moment, in the quiet between one song and the next, the room seemed to remember what Nathaniel finally understood. Kindness had never been weakness. The weakness had been believing that power made a person more worthy of being heard.